1980's Eyes of Fire is a fascinating and difficult movie to engage with that is, in my opinion, a pure demonstration of what folk horror can and should be like. And I mean that both in kind of positive and negative ways that work together to reinforce each other to make an unbalanced yet unforgettable experience. Logically, this movie makes pretty much zero sense at all for the most part, but just on an emotional, visual, kinetic, and visceral level, it makes up for that in being quite an upsetting film that honestly is kind of almost in line with what it would have been like if Lynch had made a work of outright period folk horror. I know that Lynch comparisons get made a lot to so many different works, and often inappropriately so in my eyes, but it really is dancing at times in a similar kind of way as to how he would a decade on from this, and I think that's kind of cool to see. Although this does handle the non-supernatural sections in a much more naturalistic light than I think he probably would have. It is one of the best works ever made about witchcraft, and is a film that I absolutely should have talked about in my History of Witches series, if, I'd been a little bit more diligent there, which was a big mess up on my part. So I kind of see this as an opportunity to correct my mistakes now that I made back then. So let's get to it. It was the first film by still photographer Avery Krauts, and you can see that background in every shot and cut in this. To describe it as meticulous would be an understatement. The framing, composition, use of light, movement, just all of it aids to this cohesive vision that he clearly had in mind going into this. A genuine work of pure passion. And it is one of those rare films that you can just even watch on mute and be totally enraptured by from beginning to end. Just absolutely gorgeous craftsmanship on display here that really aids to this frontier story. And in this is one of the few works that I feel truly nails otherworldly visuals. There are just moments in this that go for the bizarre and uncanny, and every single one of them just lands for me, which is really hard to do. There's some real nightmare cinema going on in this that alone is worth the price of admission. So it tells the story of a group of settlers in early American history led by an infidelitous preacher who was caught having sex with two women at the same time. The local superstitious residents try to hang him, but the ropes snap, and some take this as a message that God did not wish for this to happen. Those who still stand with him take a raft and make their way deeper into native territory to set up their own new town far away where they can be governed by their own rules as they interpret God's word. While being chased by local natives, the group flees into a valley that one of the group members has some knowledge of. A place that is considered by the natives to supposedly be so cursed that they would not dare venture there, and as such, will not continue to chase them if they set up their camp there, which is what they do, only to find themselves in a spiritual war against nature itself and the very minions of the devil. In this, we have a depiction of God versus the vessels of Satan that are portrayed in a very somewhat classical way, but also one that is, in my opinion, flawed and fairly problematic. God and religious piety are associated here in the film with humanistic progress. We start the film with these uneducated villagers trying to hang a man of the cloth, whose main tool that he uses to preach are the gospels of his books, that he alone can read and decipher. Historically, the Bible as a text was something that kept literacy alive in some parts of the world, at least in some circles, for centuries, even through some of the harshest and darkest periods of human history. Like as far as education and protection of the arts were concerned. The church kept up knowledge of architecture, art. It was the centerhold and the very foundation of the culture itself for hundreds of years. Now, one could very well legitimately argue that it was the church itself that was keeping people uninformed and illiterate in the first place. But as far as symbolically, I don't really want to get bogged down in the specifics there with this. The details don't matter entirely. The film is clearly playing with the idea of technological progress being a theologically enlightening tool, a step towards mankind's self-made apotheosis of creating himself to be divine in his Lord's own image. When the demons first attack their new village, their goal is to seek out and destroy their books, to blind them and keep them enshrouded literally in the darkness of the valley of the shadow of death. And to prevent further events like this, the settlers then build a gate to protect them from Satan, with the gate being another form of technology. A representation of God himself, both in its humanistic progress, but also in its protection from the forces of witchcraft, which are merely an extension of the devil himself. But also in this, I find it interesting that gates themselves are also, in a historical sense, very associated with witches and witchcraft and the devil. But I don't know if the filmmakers were aware of that or not. And so if God here is associated with the general idea of social progress, then the devil by that logic must be the opposite of that. He is nature, he is death, he is chaos, he is the unknown out there that must be tamed. And as such, they cut down the trees around them, which they're horrified to find human faces in, that grow around the camp to force the evil back, physically. Again, using technology in the form of axes to terraform the land of the valley to fit their needs as stewards of this earth. When the minions of the witch appear, they do so with large gusts of storm winds. And when they need to send an ill omen, they do so by leaving a decaying, severed cow's head at their gate. These nude spirits, which I unfortunately cannot show to you because they are fully nude at all times in each of their appearances, work for the witch, and are possibly associated with the local natives of this area. Or perhaps were earlier settlers who have passed away. They are certainly implied to be trapped souls that have been corrupted by this antagonistic force, but we learn little of their true nature. And in that, we do experience true fear by not knowing anything about them. But one thing is for sure, is that a native girl that the group finds turns out to be the witch itself in disguise, who has taken on this form. Who, has been responsible for all of the mayhem and madness around them. And I think at first glance, I think it is fairly reductive and problematic to have the literal forces of evil be associated with forms of these local native people, basically equating them to savages. But they're being sent here to haunt and kill these white settlers and colonizers. And I think in this, the argument could be made that the film is probably using these symbols as a somewhat form of revenge. That it is the white settlers who tell the story, and that we see these events through their eyes, and from their perspective, they see these entities and the actions that occur around them as being associated with the devil. That this witch is a high servant to the devil himself. But none of that may actually be true, and instead may be Puritan projection onto these events by their part. And the ambiguity in that is what I find interesting here about this. The film itself explains little. It leaves us with a final image that other settlers may have been corrupted by this same evil, but gives us no information as to what this may mean. It's entirely up to the individual's interpretation of what they see. It is presented to you nearly entirely without context. It is just a lens that is taking these images and giving them to us and saying that it is now our job to do the legwork to determine what they mean for ourselves. And I think a great deal of people will come away from this with many different interpretations, and I think many of them will also be kind of frustrated by that. Now, I will say that when the film was first screened at festivals, it was 108 minutes long, but the version that exists today, as it was released in 1980 to theaters, is only 86 minutes long. And from what I understand, that cut content does explain a lot of what actually happens in this movie, but I like that the film sort of requires audience participation, that it wants you to think, that it presents these things to us and asks us what we think about what we've seen, what we've experienced, both in our lives as well as in the movie itself. It's asking us to bring ourselves to the art and have a discussion. It isn't direct, it isn't moralizing, but instead it just asks questions and a particular hum of mystery that I particularly enjoy, but could be frustrating to some, I imagine. Again, much like the works of Lynch, this movie really reminds me of if you smashed Mulholland Drive and The Witch into a single film. And the fact that it has been basically totally culturally forgotten is kind of a damn shame. In a way, this is a variation of the type of story that would be told in The Wisconsin Death Trip, which is something that lingers in my mind every time I watch a film that is about colonization, man's struggle against nature, and the dwindling hope of a community in the face of lingering, prolonged, certain doom. Prairie madness is kind of a fascinating thing to me. That sort of almost quintessential rural ennui is such an essential aspect of the American aesthetic that has just been sort of baked into the country to its very core from its very founding, in part due to how large and spread out the country really is. It takes you days to drive across it by car. Wisconsin Death Trip was a collection of local newspaper articles and pictures taken by talent photographer Charles Van Schaik that detailed the lives and events in Black River Falls from roughly the years 1885 to 1900. Racism, disease, child death, mindless unexplained violence, rampant superstition, and the good parts of life too, are all shown through the same lens that falls under the joint umbrella of what it means to struggle. It is one of the quintessential collections of art about what America really is as a concept. And when I watch works like The Witch or Eyes of Fire, or even newer films like Eddington, I see distillations through a prism of variations of what this place has always been and what it always will be. Systematic destruction and distrust, superstition, hidden evils, isolation, desolation, just space. Just a wide, empty space that allows room for things to breathe that are not always good and often aren't. I think that's what this movie is really about. It's a film about America itself, and I don't even really know what it means, but I do like the questions that run through my mind when I watch it, and the way that it makes me feel.